So yeah, just to start with some seeds towards this gene card continuum, which I mentioned, and you can be the judge whether the seeds are crystallized. I think they hold something crystallized, but it's another question whether I managed to crystallize them. But I'll come to, I'll try my best towards that. But I start with something, trying to be practical or making this into a concrete example. Now, if you imagine this image as a card, the point of the black spot doesn't really matter. It could be there, it could be here. And if you imagine that somebody placed this card on some table or whatever surface, like with other people, and while the card doesn't have anything, they might call it, for example, capture reflects on its own capture. So capture reflects on its own capture. And a lot of things could happen. One of them could be that they tell the story of, which I keep short, but the story is like, there was once a creature called capture. Some other people might think of it as concept of capture, but we see it as a creature. And the capture, as its nature, would capture things, like it would hold on to something. It would take something out of the air, grasp it, and change the course of whatever it's grasping, to be capturing. But at some point of its life, there was a moment where they not only captured, but suddenly became aware and started to reflect how others saw them captured. That is, they kind of recognized an observer, somebody seeing them capturing, which put them in a trap. Because when they were capturing something and saw somebody reflecting, maybe reacting to how they captured, that made them think about their own capture. So they were captured in their own capture. And after that, they were forever trapped in a web, because every time after that they captured something, it would relate back to the earlier capture and suggest a kind of a thread or thread, therefore a web, a kind of a spider web. And then after finishing that story, they would give a ritual, practice, play, which goes as follows. Whenever this card is played, find something that is like a spot, and then see what is the web that is captured from that spot. To give an example, I did this in my near vicinity. I'll start from here. This is a lamp, if it's not obvious. It's also a card, by the way. And in a way, that lamp immediately for me was spot, like the spot in the card earlier. But then that created this thought, like, if this is the spot I'm focusing on, what is it like locking or trapping into its web? And that immediately led to the thought of, well, it's a light. And when light is turned on, it captures everything that casts its light on, like this shape, like the shapes on the right, which is why I left them in the picture, are there. They're captured. Like if it's dark room, they're not there. They're not in the forefront of the mind. So they are kind of like captured in the web cast by the light itself. But then the next, like, and this was maybe 20 seconds after, there was a package. So image of sushi roll, and there was this one red spot, which became similarly a spot in itself. But that immediately then opened up this idea of what is the web around this thing, like the small piece of fish. Of course, could be the avocado, but we'll use the piece of fish because it's red and more spotty. And then that created this interesting idea. Yeah, it's kind of like a web, a network, but this is a network that is made by things that glue to each other, the rice. And then around that, there is this harder skin, which is the seaweed, around itself, which is also a web, but now a kind of an exotic web. And then like a further continuation of this could be, once you find a web, try to express it. Sushi, a network of glutinous rice, exactly. And an exotic network at that, like an interesting network, kind of complicated, but also different than most of our thoughts of a network, because we don't normally think of, at least I don't think we normally think of the network being made by the glueness of the thing. And then around that, having a completely different way of like pressure and skin, which has only one point of glueness. So we're in a weird network land, but nevertheless, a network. But yeah, if we think about then expressing that network, that in itself becomes an interesting thing. And once again, like maybe part of that expression is the picture, which is a card. Again, that's important. Like if I would take this picture, that would be a card. But then, like maybe 30 seconds after, there was the sheet. Now, why I took the picture this way is because the spot was the flowers. Well, any of the flowers, but you can pick any one of them. But then that immediately suggested a very different kind of network, because the flowers are connected like stem-wise, that there's this branching stem, but then they're connected in distribution-wise, because you know how sheets have these prints that have this sort of, what to call it, kind of like a interlaced patterns that create like something you can print in meters and meters, and the texture pattern continues. So in a way, even the kind of things that are not branched are connected in a different kind of way. They're connected in a patterned way. But then the branches are connected more in kind of natural way. So what is the network that has two different modes of connection? But then that led to another thought that, well, the growing path can be thought of like if it would be biological, it would continue to grow, perhaps. So in this network, there's like a thing that grows in branches, which is a way of networking, but then like lies in this interlacing, intertwining of patterns, which is another kind of networking. Almost like Lego blocks, but not separate, more like interlaced, like that they go in between one another. So this whole exercise, I mean, the taking of the pictures and thinking about them took a bit more, but like finding them was super quick. And to jump a bit higher and look what was the pattern that created it. Well, first there was the card, which was just this. And then there was the story, which could have been something else, but it was this weird story. And then that story then led to the practice, which is simple enough, but if you actually do it, then results like this can come about. And all of that coming from the simplest of cards. Now I'll pause here because there is more to this, but just to check up on any questions, comments to this. Maybe slightly mysterious, but I swear I have a point. Yes, cards are devices of capture and reflection. I could say something. Maybe I'd say this later because I'm trying to get you to speak because I speak too much.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the capacity of cards to sort of be very focused in their scope, and it's a form of conceptual capture.
Yeah.
And reflection, because they imply an action, right? Like they are elements of play or associated to play.
Yeah.
So they sort of imply reflective capacity in their actioning. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and maybe I'll say this shortly because we'll return to this, but it's a sort of like towards a potential crystallization. So like I mentioned earlier that for me, one of the sort of haunting parts of the card is I really think of it in the same level, or try to get to think of it in the same level as we think of words and concepts and this sort of very basic structures of meaning. Like in a sense that we have a word implying a concept, but those have a certain kind of form. Like they're not the thinking, of course, they're very kind of integral to us, but the card has a different form. But what if it was just as elemental or potentially just as elemental as, say, a word? And I think Pablo put it nicely that there is then differences. Like, what if you could, like, to put it metaphorically, speak in cards? And there, like, if we think about the scenario earlier that somebody played this card on the table and then added to it the story and this practice, and then leads to this practice. And then you compare it to how words communicate. That in itself is like an interesting difference for me. And there's more to that angle, but I'll try to leave room for others to say things as well. Okay, let's take another example because otherwise, even this was slightly mysterious and abstract, but I'll take this. So I wanted to make a different kind of card. I mean, this could be the card. Of course, the layout would be better, but I made it easy because I just had a book open, PDF, and I started reading from it. And it wasn't like picked as some kind of particularly good book, but I just took this part and not as a magnificent example, but just as an example of anything. And it has this sort of certain kind of like sentence, but a kind of an idea as well, like as a military outpost. Forge, which is later defined as a city, was too cramped to cope with all the refugees from the below. So the dwarves began feverishly build and expand the outpost. Today, there's relatively little actual mountain left. Forge is more mountain-shaped city. But okay, to this, if this was a card, let's say I could also practice a play, but this time the play is when you play this card, you tell the story, but you rewrite or retell it. So, for example, as a floating island, the city or maybe the forge was too cramped to cope with all the refugees from the depths of the sea. So the water droplets began feverishly build and expand the network of flotillas. Today, there is actually very little actual sea left. Forge is more sea-shaped city. And then whatever I told is a new card. Now this card, even though the rules are simple, is rather interesting. It keeps on producing new cards, which are retellings of the same story or parable or whatever, which is not a parable in itself. It's just an excerpt. And so if one would play it, it would even form a kind of continuum, almost like a text form in itself that would be like endless versions that kind of take this, what to call it, like a structure of a thought, but give it endless forms by the way of playing. And that also fits the idea of a card. And it's but a very different card. And the one thing still to highlight from this is, like in both cases, in the first card example and in the second card example, the god is almost like a little generator, little engine in itself. Like it's very clear here, but it's true of the earlier one as well, that it's actually generating. It's like the fact that this would create the new card every time it's played makes it like more underlined. But nevertheless, like that side of it is interesting. And this combination of, yes, there's text, but then there is actual operation on it. And that, and then, but still like the relation of what's in the card and what's outside the card can kind of resemble a little bit like tarot cards have like the card itself and there's explanation, and there's no really like a clear borderline where it stops, which then expands the use of the card itself. So you could say these rules don't have to be in the card, but they can be culture around the card itself, like almost like growing around the card, and then the card itself can grow. Okay, I'll shut up again for to leave some room for others. Hope capture, structure, actuality, reflection, mutation, potentiality,
I'm just thinking of the structure of the card as a form of capture and the reflection as a form of constant change. It shares some characteristics of like memes or like memetic propagation, because then the new mutation becomes a capture structure in itself that allows for further mutation. So it has that characteristic.
Mhm.
What you did with this text, right, was a bit like that. You sort of identified a structure, which I think that's very interesting, that you can define a new structure from
Mhm.
what exists that is not so set, which happens with memes, but not so fluidly, I would say. So I like that as the action of defining the structure. That's interesting, and that's what leads to, I guess that's what constructs the structure of mirrors that
Mhm.
allows for a reflection to happen, right? Like, what mirrors am I choosing to reflect upon, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also one key thing is it has this sort of similar generative qualities, but then the key difference is here the generation is also design. It doesn't have to be, of course. It could be left to whatever people want to do with it, but it can be. It's not always the same. It's not like the mimetic generation in general. It's here. It's the a kind of rewriting kind of palimpsest structure, like and in the other case, it's a little bit different. It's like it's capturing the environment into and finding webs from it. And even if those webs were made into new cards, it's still different. It's more branching out here. It's more, uh, yeah. It's hard to put them in words because they don't quite follow the concepts. That's I think an interesting part of it. But um, so another crystallization from here, or at least an attempt of one, is like I had uh, one uh, defining sentence for this, which was the card is not the card, which is, yeah, sounds mysterious, but there's actually a sense to that, uh, which kind of relates to how actually the least important part of a word is its actual shape. I mean, of course, for layout, so on, this can be important, but it's almost like to function as a word, it wants to leave what it is physically kind of behind, because all the important things happen afterwards. And to get to cards into this, and also genes, similarly potentially, into this actually flexibility of expression and operation and play, it kind of has to do the same move. So the word is not the word. Um, it moves into other realms that it's sensible form. But similarly, the card is not the card, but it moves to other realms to its uh, uh, effect on meaning. And that thought in itself frees up uh, how to practically operate on them. And I mean, both of these cases were examples of that. Like I played a card uh, like this, but then like there was the story, could have been something else. There was the practice, but could have been something else. They were not necessarily in the card. They could have been, but it's probably practically limiting, but it's also limiting actually the usage of it. But having the sort of like expectation of generation, but then like adding that from the outside frees it up. And the same here, the practice wasn't in the card necessarily. But yeah, that opens up this different way of thinking about the card. But the same is actually true, or let's say useful for things like decks, or that is deck is not necessarily the deck. Like to make an example, what if I suggest that these were in the same deck? I mean, maybe not the most naturally fitting examples, but just to think about the idea of like you have this kind of cards, and like the deck becomes a different kind of functionality. But what if the normal, when people think about decks, they think, okay, there is like a pile of cards, and then they are shuffled, and that's certainly a possibility. But what if the deck, quotation marks, deck part is that these two cards are never far from the other, that when one is played, the other will start to creep in. And that's the deck part of it, or something else. So in this case, like, I wish I had a better fitting pair of cards, but like, let's say this one is played and then the new story is made, but maybe this focus becomes actually towards the retelling of the card, and people focus maybe imagining the place or the images that come from the text itself, and then find these webs from there. Like, yeah, like I said, I think this connection could be made better, but like I think the structure itself, yeah, the mechanic that exists in between the cards, just like the mechanics for words exist in between and beyond the words themselves. And like just having the similar basic structure starts to free them up. Like these things I was really picking quickly, and they were just quickly creating very interesting relations to the world. And opening like different possibilities, and also like that the cards would have their own life. Like one version of this was similarly like whenever you find, say, like a new spot, you can make it a card of its own, and then, but maybe you play it with the original spot always, that it becomes like a modifier to the earlier one. Who knows? But like that opened like different possibilities in and of itself. And but then just to make really quick anecdotes, maybe I pick this one. This is one that I can put quickly. Oh, Linda had a battery problem. But yeah, so I'll make this quickly, and then so this was just I used as my training material or testing material, just movies essentially, like, or because for a room-bound person, this is a good way to get different environments. Nerdy, but I guess forgivable. And seeing this, I got an idea of a suite of frames. And then that created this, now the suit is different, is like the suite of frames is grows and expands, not without any set number or limit, whenever you find a frame. And then when you find a frame, like make it individual. So here it's a frame kind of in darkness. It has this sort of port gateway like quality, but then it has this quality that where you're coming from through the frame gate, it has something in store, like the whatever boxes on the left side of it, and then you're coming through it with a light, a lantern itself, and So it has this sort of sense of like stepping through and leaving behind something in terms of storage, and then having the light forward, because the forward is in darkness. And now there is a sort of kind of contemplation, reflection of the frame itself. But if I would pick another, find another source for this frame, so then it would probably start to expand other sides of the frame itself. And of course, it doesn't have to be an image. It could be a place that I see in the outside city. It could be even a sequence of sound, whatever it is. So that becomes in itself like a game to generate a suit. So that's, and there would be other examples, but I'll stop here again. Maybe after shutting up for a while, I could draw some lines, threads together from here. And I will shut up in terms of.
I was just thinking of the suit as again a mechanic that exists in between the cards, and
Yes.
also that creates in betweenness, right?
Yes.
And usually we have a very static vision of the suit because cards are physical and they have the suit printed on them. But with a dynamic notion of the suit, you could just associate cards of different nature, and just by naming them as part of the same suit, you've now make them a collective entity, right? That's an interesting mechanic. I guess the deck acts in a similar way.
Yes.
Although the deck does not necessarily implies like a sense of familiarity as the suit does. The suit kind of, yeah, it is a different connotation, but both dynamics act in a similar way.
Yeah, like they have the same quality of going beyond just the sense form or even the kind of particular rule form, but kind of becoming this sort of changer of not just meaning but operation, which I think is important. Like it's not just kind of like interpreting words into this is what this means, but it's actually kind of interpreting operation of what to do and how to act. And then like once again, like thinking it like this opens up a lot of possibilities. Like just to make an improvised example, what if the suite of frames had a card that simply defines something towards the suite of frames is whenever you play one suite of frames card, play another and let them frame each other, like use the other as a frame to the other. I don't know if that works, but it's an interesting thought in itself, and mostly here to highlight this, how even the suit can be different of what we think of the suit, but it still has like familiarity to the suit itself. Just like we use words, they are always different in meaning. Like when I say word here, it's different than when I say word in another sentence. It's kind of similar behavior, but once again, having this sort of operative quality in the same mix of fluidity and flexibility. And of course, like what is probably apparent, like this is about this sort of like really any media is possible here, but it's also like really this how like this, like being able to have not just the card itself, but something around the card as becoming kind of part of the card itself, just like the tarot cards. If there never were these texts or other explanations around them about the meaning, there would be much less. But also because these explanations and extra text can grow the whole tarot card a lot. Like or not because, but in addition to being able to grow it, they offer flexibility because they could be, this time we use this explanation in relation to this card, it could be this move or this play or this ritual. Now we add the story. Now we don't add the story. Like the first card could have been played without the story itself, and so on and so forth. But to draw some maybe lines together, unless somebody else has something to add. Okay, maybe I'll then do the.
I was just thinking of the cards, like physically just having the cards and having a card that describes suits. I think we had one, I don't remember.
Yes.
And then the implication of having the suit card have another suit, like that just, yeah, it is interesting to both regard, I mean, the capacity of the cards to create this homogeneous format that allows for this meta quality. Yeah, just I was tripping on that. That's really, really crazy.
Yeah, and actually I had one thing to show that I just remembered because it's a key part. And then I'll wrap up. I was reading this game, which both delighted me and annoyed me. There are parts of design I don't like, but that doesn't matter because it has something also rather interesting in itself. But it's yeah, I think it's Incarnus. Yes, it's you know. So now this, I don't want to tell the whole game and just highlighting a couple of things. So this game plays with cards that you make. Now, but then like the cards have this certain logic to them that you start with what's called a domain, and there is like the domain is essentially like a large concept like air, or could also be clouds and so on. And so, but then you can expand that or detail that, say, to a personification. It's like, let's say, well, there is the sky, and then somebody has made an example of Zeus, and then they are in the same card, and they are in these corners, because you can see in the bottom right, there is like this sort of system for the cards themselves for this game, which is like the different areas have like different meanings, and wherever the text is also sets a type, like the domain is bottom left, and the name, which would be the sort of personification on top right, and so on. And, but there are other things like whenever something is named, it could have a card underneath it, like the Zeus has like a title called thrower, but then it has a form of bolt, and it has the domain of lightning, which is in the case of Zeus probably clear, or what does it mean. So you have this sort of like way of like wrapping a card into play, which is just one way. But I'll point out another, which is like here, well, the personifications become gods, and then this game has tensions, which is like relations between gods. It's kind of poses to be tensions, but nevertheless. And then in the middle, in the table, so to speak, these are players. There is landmark cards, which are like places essentially. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not about not so much focusing on this particular play, but now when you take all of what was said about the sort of flexibility of cards, and you bring the flexibility of play. That is, like if you build similar structures or something like game-like structures, say even around this, the first one, the capture reflecting on its own capture, and not just the card, but maybe the practice. But then it's a way of finding a web, which you then put on a table somehow, and it's or whatever you do with it, or you take the second card with the text and you actually use it to describe, you put it on a table and use it to describe a part of the world, to give another example. Or you put it into a person and you make it into a memory. And it's I guess we're having hijacking possibly. I'll check who this is. Sorry. Hello. Are you early or? Sorry, like we have still a meeting going on. Or sorry, yeah. If you want to be here, that's okay. But yeah, no worries. Yeah, if you wanted to come here to this particular meeting, more than welcome. I was just, because there was a danger of another meeting overlapping. There was a possibility that people might be here for different reasons. That's why I said that you're definitely welcome to be. So yeah, so to take this, just this sort of possibility of giving this sort of game-like form to whatever was earlier said in about cards. One practical comment, like I will post this recording, by the way. So if it seems confusing now, referring to the things earlier, that's okay. You can probably catch up from whatever the video is, like from the earlier example. But yeah, like having kind of like addressed this sort of game part that expands the possibilities already baked from the card form already, as mentioned, that there's game structures that the cards can kind of further articulate directions and dimensions. That's maybe the final perspective for the wrapping up part. But any comments on that?
I was thinking of the network quality of these mechanics and how, like, yeah, it also relates to cards and their modular capacity for networked narration, I guess, or network narrative building. But I think what's interesting about this mechanic that you're showing is how tensions bring new gods, that bring new tensions, that bring new gods, like that in between element really ties up a narrative in a particular way, which I think is a really, really interesting thing to keep in mind as yeah, general mechanic.
Yeah, and it's also like really here as an example that here's tension, and that's certainly useful, but it could be anything. And also like the cards, which are really just personifications, intentions being relations, and then the landmarks are more space, location, like node-based space, like land to be in. But they could be, all of them could be something else. But it's merely pointing out like the earlier examples were kind of like card alone with some expansions, yes, but mostly about the cards themselves. But now putting these structures, whatever the structures are, then opens up different possibilities, like using the case of the text that has to be like always retold as land, or use the frame, the suite of frames as a kind of like ways to like create trouble or succession. It's like something happens, like something like a scene. But after every scene, you play a card, maybe a random card of a frame, and that is then the something that generates transition, and then another scene. And now the whatever we talked about, the suite of frames becomes different again, like it has a new behavior. But to kind of concretize or wrap up these threads, which are kind of opening possibilities, like if we think of this, like, I don't know the exact pathway towards this, but like to draft out a bit, is like in towards the kind of proposal direction, is like, if one starts with the proposal of a card and started maybe even with the what if question, like, what if we took the form of a card as seriously we take the form of a word or a concept? And you kind of proceed from there along the thematics mentioned here. And then you make maybe even a comparison like this, how, which were kind of already made alongside the way, like how this becomes like designing of the operation act generation. And then like how this behavior is, once again, the card is not the card, or just like the word goes beyond its senses and actually becomes meaningful when it kind of escapes its particular layout or something. Like how this behavior is in card. And then you have examples of this. And of course, then from that branches out the geme as form, because it's almost like a branch of a tree, and or can be thought of in that the gene form as is like the kind of a form of a card, but then builds its own pocket universe, kind of not just meaning but play again, because it's addressing the design of thought. So if we think of that as kind of proposal, and then yes, speculation, but also examples, not just like pure speculation, but kind of pointing out what comes out of that, and then forms. And then you can make that proposal to be open-ended, is like more things can be added to. Like here's another card form, and here's how it behaves, and here's an interesting behavior, here's a full game, whatever it is. So like it's almost like a proposal, not in the sense of a closed text, but like a kind of tree that grows and can keep on growing, but has like a definite beginning in a way. That's very kind of rough drafting and doesn't have to follow that pathway, but just like that illustrates, I think, some possibilities at least of what could happen with such a proposal. Do you find any sense to that proposal? What do you think?
I
Or
do.
that,
Absolutely.
and it also branches towards this, and I think that probably should be addressed maybe even in the beginning parts, is that how this relates to kind of organization, like, and it's actually kind of, I think, an easy connection to make, Like one can go back to the earlier case that I said, if there's like if you put a card on a table that has a question mark, and then you set a rule that anybody who taps the card can make a question, and even though people can make questions all the time, it changes the situation. That is, it organizes the situation or modifies the organization of the situation itself. Because then you can give an example. What if you put a role on a card? What if you took this card and, or whatever card, maybe there's a better one, this might not be the best, but you make it into a role and then you add, just like the earlier moves or rituals added to the earlier cards, you add moves to that role. And then you're already in the kind of core questions of organization itself. And it's not the solution, like it's not like always do it this way, but it's opening up this sort of expression space and design space, which is rather bad, but it's also very, very like multicolored, like it has so many directions and possibilities, which is rather interesting in itself.
I'm thinking of what could be the best way to capture this into a card or a modular thing that we can then activate. Is this like an instruction? Is this form like a method? Or what do you think is the best way to capture this into an actionable element?
I think actually, I mean, if one wants to do card, I would say cards like multiple. It also kind of increases the flexibility because like you can change one card in a minute, so to speak. But it opens up another doorway, which is like, let's say it starts with just text definition. And I wouldn't kind of try to avoid such things. I mean, it's not like forced that it should be text, but I don't think it's a problem. But you would treat that text kind of like a card itself, even if it's a page or even several pages, but it's kind of a card. Because once again, now that we kind of left behind the stiffness of senses, like it doesn't have to have necessarily even a card form, but it can be treated as a card. So this text that this, I'll start maybe like just as an example, could start this what if with this what if question. What if we treated card with the same depth and seriousness or depth and seriousness as we treat, say, word or a concept? What would come from that exploration, and then you would explain that. But that could be thought of still as a card. And then you approach this, which in normal form would be thought of as, say, an essay or text to read as, well, this is normally played this way, that you play this card first, which is that text, for example. And then you play these cards, which might be even other text or cards in between. I'm just kind of like speculating on possibilities here, but like all of this is kind of now in the realm of that's fitting, that's like conceivable in this kind of vision of the card as a possibility.
I would propose that we do it. I mean, maybe not now, but that we, yeah, lay down which cards this can, yeah, what cards can come out of this mechanic.
Yeah, and I think I agree, and it's also like by my experience of playtesting, like which examples were in the early parts, then like once you start it, the games start to kind of suggest themselves, like even those, but they also come in this interesting form that you know, you take this one card, which was just a dot, but then it had this practice of searching for the point itself from the environment, some point, and then there's like the light being in that. Like if you play this card and you play this, that you then look around and you search for this sort of point of capturing, and then you look what it sets by being a point. Is that a game? Yeah, kind of, but it's also very small. It's very modular. It kind of retains this card likeness that, okay, this could be a sequence in a game, or a part in a game, or something that happens in a game when you go to a certain area. It has that kind of a form, like it has Lego piece-ness, like quality. So so you get this sort of like yes, game-like, but it comes in this neat little packages. I mean, not necessarily, but tends to come in this neat little packages, which you can then combine or put in series phases and set continuities. So all of that, yeah, like I'm just now going through different points, but yeah, maybe the capture from there is like, I agree. I think expressing that in a very drafty form and using that expression to go further to actually kind of explore that space, including the kind of gene, the meme that plays as a branch of it, will actually, let's say, sophisticate itself through actually making it. Like it will find like the play of it and testing of it and trying out different forms will become more nuanced and more varied in forms by just starting the journey. Yes, agreed. And yeah, and I think in terms of being a proposal or directional proposal, and it doesn't have to be the only one we work on, but it's an interesting possibility in itself. Like to do, and maybe at this point I'll stop sharing because I talked long enough, and sorry for this, like it probably was hard to jump in between, but hopefully you got some impression. Do you have any comments or reflections? It doesn't matter if they are not like if they are fragments or whatever, because that's but if you have some to say. Yeah, sorry for the context was where we were earlier, so you'll get the context from a video because there was a lot of like groundwork in the earlier parts, and we were kind of at the conclusion phase of things once it came in, so it's understandably not the easiest thing to jump into, but you'll get it in the video. I think it's interesting. Hopefully you'll find it interesting as well. And it's also like based on the one thing that might be nerdy is like we process this sort of like, let's say, the expressive power of kind of starting from cards and kind of breaking them down into elements of what's really in the card itself for quite a long time in XORG. So I think the whatever is in the video is at least kind of sort of a good starting point, but I might be kind of blind to maybe it's missing some pieces. But if you have any questions after it, like shoot in any form, whether it's a Telegram message or whatever. Right? So up to comments, last questions or whatever later. So yeah, this was like a snapshot dive, like taking the sea of different proposals and different directions we could go, and like take this one particular thing and like exploring where it could go. And I'm quite intrigued by it, I can say, like, and especially one thing that really intrigued me was how kind of lightly powerful it was. Like the timings I gave earlier, like this, like finding this took 20 seconds, or and then what it led to was like a very different like way of approaching the situation, whatever the situation was. So this lightness, fastness of doing, like getting you completely elsewhere, so to speak, is kind of promising, I think. Anything anybody wants to add? Pablo, you were on point with the comments.
I shared some DALI images on the Telegram channel, some physical devices for capture and reflect operations. They are a bit too literal, but might spawn some interesting ideas.
Yeah, it's a whole dimension here also, because it's like being able to generate the, let's call in the sources of the cards, like in the examples, these were images and text that of course existed, but then what is the cycle of being able to generate those images, and what you can do with the play that affects the prompts, for example, like what kind of prompts you put, and kind of starts to play with the prompt generated image relation, and makes the prompt into a game.
Yeah, we should try to do some, not only images, but I think maybe even it would be interesting to do some chat GPT or some, chat
Also that.
GPT, experiments with explaining a game and playing alongside the AI. Like I've seen some super interesting experiments on like AI driven RPG mechanics. So maybe there is a part of their reflection that could happen this way. That could be very interesting.
Yeah, I actually kind of like experimented with this as well, like even back into GPT-2 days. Like it's interesting, like, and it's also like what is interesting is like you can make it RPG like, but it's actually kind of like, I think it's almost like you modify it a bit to, let's say, bring the strengths of the medium out. ChatGPT is of course more flexible than the earlier ones, but I think it's like you can take those qualities but tailor them a bit to that media, and then that leads to some interesting game structures. They're also interesting in the sense that they're kind of new. Like many of the things that are done now in the kind of, let's say, the role-playing game of the XORG generation, it's still like trying to do exactly normal role-playing game, and then kind of not being quite good because it's trying to kind of hit its head on the wall a bit, because it's trying to kind of mimic like quite straightforward. But if you actually kind of like start from, hey, what are the strengths of this? You might just get more richness out of it. That's a whole nother topic. Yeah, that's a whole nother question. But I think the whole generation of it is a branch of branches, because then the image generation is different from the actual generation. And of course, they can play together. Like stable diffusion, yeah, like stable diffusion for text is not really like the text is still kind of dominated by the predict next, whatever the fancy word for that logic is. But like, I think even the more advanced ones that are still not yet public are still like predicate network kind of models.
It could become a long-termish project or mid-term project that we set up our own data set and we train an algorithm for further experimentation. That could be both a fun exercise and an exercise in autonomy as well. So yeah, we should totally keep it in mind.
Yeah, as a practical comment for a change, there are actually some open source versions of ChatGPT, like essentially replicating the operations as much as they're known, because OpenAI AI is shitty and doesn't exactly tell, but at least the pathway, like ChatGPT started actually from the programming version of the GPT, which is interesting in itself. Like it was the first call was that, and then they added other parts later. The reasons for this are not exactly explained even in the papers, but it has a reason. So some people have kind of replicated that pathway and made some open source versions of it, but I don't know how good they are and how easy they are to run. That's a whole other question. But yeah, a final comment on this. It is an interesting field, like while it's a branch, and I think like it's really like this root, like that develops into branches is key thing to express. But like these branches are interesting, the generation ones, because with all the richness of this sort of generation, like the one thing that kind of glares out to me is that really the richness is a small little fragment, like let's say mid journeys and stable diffusions is like it's often like people make one image and it's a cool image and then they make another image, but there's really no connections between them. But what if you make a game structure that makes them kind of grow into each other? Like it's actually the generation of one image. It's not just a separate singular act, but actually a move, which then complements another move. So it builds to a larger whole. And that's an area that is surprisingly little. There's surprisingly little in that area. So building this sort of game structure towards it is quite interesting. Yeah, that's true what you said, Fotis. Yeah, like it comes with the limitations. Sadly, the best version you can get is kind of open AI side. But still, like I would approach this also like trashily, like especially explorations. Like if it means that the best way to test it is to use OpenAI, then one uses OpenAI because it might still teach you something that you can use later without OpenAI. So I don't mind. Like I wouldn't be like too absolute about it. Whatever works, kind of hack mentality. But yeah, like and hopefully also Eva, you know, you're a listener today, as you said in the beginning, like hopefully that was communicating and also condolences on maladies that you have. But yeah, I like this is all fairly fresh. Like it's last couple of days, and this is why it's like while I tried to make it concrete by the examples, I think it can be certainly be made more easily communicatable in the future. But I do think there is something there. There's a very rich seed in the heart of it for that can be grown into many directions. But yeah, let's visit the topic of how this direction of proposal and kind of communicating it outwards could be started practically speaking, because yeah, I do think it leads to a very interesting proposal, which isn't game-like, very much at heart, but it's not like any of the games that are like currently conventions of games, which is interesting. All right. Any last words? Now I'm trying to hook somebody to say last words. I will actually, the last words will be now in secret because I will stop the recording. So somebody will miss the last words. So that's what you will be missing. They will probably appear, but whoever watches the recording will.